Friends, good evening and welcome to TheoEd Talks. My name is Ryan Bonfilio and I'm the founding director of the TheoEd series, and I also teach Old Testament at Emory's Candler School of Theology. We are so thrilled to be here in Charlotte, North Carolina at the beautiful Gambrell Center for the Arts and Civic Engagement. What an incredible venue. Whether you are here with us in person in the theater or are streaming with us online, we are so excited to share the TheoEd program with you. And we have an incredible program ahead of us tonight. In just a few minutes, you're going to have the chance to hear from a nationally known speaker and preacher, the founding director of Yale Center for Faith and Culture, the dean of Howard University Divinity School, and the CEO of Roof Above, a nonprofit organization here in Atlanta. Charlotte, excuse me. You can tell where I'm from. In addition to hearing from these four dynamic speakers, you'll also have the chance to hear from one spectacularly mediocre MC. That's me. And now look, you got to cut me some slack on the whole MC thing. It's not like I went to school for this, right? My graduate studies are in Old Testament. Back in college, a long time ago, I was a chemistry major. And in between, wait for it, I was a college wrestling coach. So this is not exactly the same sort of CV that Jimmy Kimmel or Ellen DeGeneres has when they do their work. If you're wondering, by the way, how does a chemistry major turned wrestling coach become an Old Testament professor? You're in good company, because my parents are still asking the same question. So friends, what exactly is TheoEd? TheoEd is an ecumenical speaker series that brings together leading thinkers in the church and the academy to give the talk of their lives in 20 minutes or less. By packaging powerful ideas in bite-sized talks, we hope to spark conversations that will change the way you think about God, religion, and the power of faith to shape lives and communities. In essence, TheoEd seeks to do for the Bible, theology, and spirituality what the popular TED series has done for technology, entertainment, and design. That's why this evening you won't hear our speakers give sermons or even academic lectures. Rather, our speakers will deliver highly polished, no-notes, TED-style talks that make the best learning available in a format that you can listen to in the time it takes you to walk your dog or pick your kids up at school, or here in Charlotte, go about 2 blocks on South Boulevard during rush hour. The TheoEd series began back in 2017 through work I was doing as a scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. Since then, TheoEd has grown into a partnership with the Candler Foundry, a new initiative at Emory University that seeks to make the best of theological learning accessible and engaging to the broader public. At the Candler Foundry, we believe that theological learning doesn't just happen in an academic classroom, but it can and should happen out in communities, and in response to questions and issues that matter to the church and to the world. To find out more about the Candler Foundry and the work we do and how you might be involved, you can visit the table out in the lobby after the event is over, or you can visit us online at candlerfoundry.emory.edu. Now, I'm pleased to say that this is tonight the 7th installment of the TheoEd series. And over the past 5 years, we've had the chance to hear from some absolutely amazing speakers. People like Amy Jo Levine and Shane Claiborne, Jonathan Merritt and Lauren Winner, Will Gaffney and Austin Channing Brown, Pete Enns, and many, many more. All of our TheoEd events up to this point have been hosted in Atlanta, where TheoEd was born. And so tonight is the first time that we have taken TheoEd on the road, and we are so glad to be here in Charlotte for our first event. Now, some people have asked, well, why Charlotte? Why come here first? You could have picked any city in the country, right? And it's true, we could have. People ask, is it because Charlotte is such a beautiful city? Well, maybe. Is it because Charlotte is a hub for business and finance and, of course, NASCAR? Or is it because Charlotte is the home to so many incredible churches and colleges? Well, all of them are part of the reason. But the real reason we're here in Charlotte for the first stop on the TheoEd tour is because of your Southern hospitality. Honestly, I really think Charlotte might be the friendliest city that I have ever visited. Now, I should qualify that by admitting that I was born and raised in Philadelphia, a city not exactly known for its hospitality, Southern or otherwise. You know, Philadelphia means city of brotherly love, which I always felt strange until I realized that the type of love that Philly has to give is not always the type of love that you want. For instance, did you know one time at the halftime of an Eagles game, the fans threw snowballs at Santa Claus? Seriously? Santa? There was a lot of coal given out that year in the greater Philadelphia area. Or you all have heard about Philly cheesesteaks, right? Well, the classic places to get Philly cheesesteaks are Pat's and Geno's. And the way to order, and the way to get a Philly cheesesteak is you want it with cheese and onions. But you don't walk up to the counter and say, cheese and onions, please. You have to say, Wit Whiz. Nothing else, just Wit Whiz. And if you don't say it that way, you are sent to the back of the line and they will not serve you. Now, compare that to the deli I stopped at yesterday afternoon when I first arrived in Charlotte. Before I could even order my sandwich, I had had a 5-minute conversation with the lady behind the counter, in which time I learned the names of her 4 kids, the sports that each of her 11 grandkids are doing, and where to get the best deal on dry cleaning. I was only going to be here for 2 days. Needless to say, the customer service experience in Charlotte is not like Pat's and Geno's. Wherever we host TheoEd, we make a point that anyone can access TheoEd anywhere, anytime. That's why we make high-quality videos of each of our talks available on our website, TheoEd.com, for free. There you can find dozens of talks that we've done from previous events. You can also, on our website, TheoEd.com, subscribe to our podcast. And for each of our talks, we have designed a discussion guide to go along with it. The idea here is that you might use the talk and the accompanying discussion guide as a type of curriculum or guide for your Sunday school class, your small group, or even your book club. We hope that you might check these out and use them in that way. Tonight, you're going to have the chance to hear from some amazing speakers, but we also want to invite you into the conversation. As you have questions or comments about the individual talks, please feel free to put them through to us by texting those comments and questions to the number that appears printed on the bottom of your program, or if you're streaming with us online, it's appearing on the screen now and appears in the comment section. Your comments will be anonymous. We will gather your questions, and then at the end of the program, we're going to invite all 4 speakers back onto the stage, and I'll have a chance to present to them a selection of the questions that you have passed along. Finally, before we get started, let me just offer a few words of thanks to those who have helped make TheoEd possible. First and foremost, we are so grateful for Queen's University of Charlotte for hosting us. The staff at the Gambrell Center, Evan and Sarah and Cecily and the others, have been absolutely extraordinary helping to make this happen, both in the front of the house and also behind the scenes. And I also want to thank Joey Haynes and Dr. Suzanne Henderson, who have really been part of these conversations about bringing TheoEd to Charlotte from the very beginning. So thank you all so much for that support. I also want to thank First Presbyterian Church of Charlotte, who is our official partner and has really made it possible to bring TheoEd on the road to Charlotte. Gerald Kiesler has been my partner in crime and helper and counselor at times throughout this whole planning period, and she's been so unfailingly gracious in her support and help, and I'm so grateful for her. I also want to name and thank the members of the Willard Committee, who were really in on the ground floor of imagining what this event would look like and who we would invite to be a part of it. And finally, let me thank my team at the Candler Foundry. Demelis, Krista, Evie, Janine, Chloe, and Erica, you have been extraordinarily helpful, extraordinarily creative, and it's no exaggeration to say that we simply could not have done this without you. So please join me in a big round of applause for all those who have helped make TheoEd possible. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Yolanda Pierce, who is the Dean of the Howard University Divinity School in Washington, D.C. She is the first woman appointed to this position in the Divinity School's 150-year history. Before arriving at Howard, she worked with the Smithsonian Museum to found the Center for African American Religious Life, and she also taught religion and literature at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I was lucky enough to have her as a teacher. She is the author of numerous books, most recently being In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. Her talk tonight is titled Salvation and Soul Food. Please join me in welcoming to the TheoEd stage, Dr. Yolanda Pierce.
My African ancestors did not come to these shores as empty vessels or as blank slates. In this ocean, hundreds, then thousands, then millions of people of African descent were brought through what I'm calling an involuntary baptism. During the transatlantic slave trade, this involuntary baptism, you see, something died and something was also born. My ancestors came to these shores in cargo ships, human cargo. And when they got here, there was a cauldron and a cradle of early American religiosity. Part of how we understand this story is about the stripping away. And certainly there was a stripping away of these African peoples of languages and names and material objects and certain kinds of traditions. The stripping away, people think, of everything. But I want you to know that something survives the voyage. And so this cauldron that we have of these early Africans, soon to be early African Americans, and they encountered these shores of North America and South America. Something like 20 to 30% of these Africans were practicing Muslims. Some significant portion of them were practitioners of traditional African religions, but a number of them were already practicing Christians. And I need you to know that, because when my ancestors got to this shore, North America, they were not encountering the divine for the first time. They brought the divine with them. They brought the divine with them. And so what we see in this early American cauldron is the adaptation, the adoption, but also the transformation of American religion. So my ancestors went into the hush harbors. those secret places, those wilderness places, and in those hush harbors where they were left alone, they practiced, they remembered, they poured out libations, they did the ring shout, they buried the dead according to customs that were ancient. They also went to church. They also practiced Christianity. But Christianity was being changed even as they were being changed. This cauldron produces what we call American religion, but I need you to know that it is what it is today because of my African ancestors. In the hush harbors, they were developing theology, systematic, deliberate, constructive. Do you know how I know? It's in the music, it's in the songs, it's in the spirituals. They were developing a Christology. Who is Jesus? Oh, Jesus is Mary's little baby. So they sang about Mary's little baby. They sang about the Exodus. They sang about the God of deliverance. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? They sang about heaven. But be clear, this heaven was a place of justice, because as one of the spirituals says, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. And so they're developing this systematic and deliberate and constructive theology in the hush harbors and in the wilderness and later on in the institutional churches. I want you to know that this faith was both praise and protest. It was praise because that's what it means to be people of faith, to thank God for where we are and who we are, to give honor and thanks for survival. It was also protests against the condition of enslavement, protests against bondage, protests against all of the forces and powers and principalities that for 400 years kept people in bondage. And that praise and that protest meets. And it creates the institutional Black church. That's where this part of the story I want to share with you starts. The institutional Black church, the building of buildings, of churches, of schools, the creation of a theology, the creation of ways and practices of worship, all of this happening in that early cauldron of American religion. But the 20th century, where this part begins, is also about involuntary migration. And we often don't tell the story that way, because if the transatlantic slave journey, that voyage, that Mayatha, was hundreds, then thousands, then millions, what you see in the 20th century after the end of the First World War and the Second World War are millions of African Americans leaving the rural South to places north and west. Millions leaving behind racial violence, leaving behind lynchings, leaving behind sharecropping, which was just slavery by another name. And so they left by foot, by train, by mule. They went to places like Chicago. Chicago is simply Mississippi with snow. They went places like New York and St. Louis. Some went west to California. They went to Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. in search of a promise. The institutional Black church helped to make that promise a possibility. In Chicago, there would be churches. Churches would hang a white cloth outside of their window. And that white cloth was a signal to these migrants coming from Mississippi that we have room here. There's food for you here. We can help you find a job here. I mean, imagine that, the church actually doing the work of the gospel. So they sit and they went, and these migrants used the institutional church in search of the American dream. Part of the institutional Black church is an official office which really has almost no parallel anywhere else. It is the Mothers Board. I got to tell you about the church mothers. The Mothers Board. The Mothers Board is an official ecclesial office. You are a church mother. That is like being a deacon or an elder or a trustee. The Mothers Board was comprised of older African American women. The only qualification you needed for the Mothers Board was that somebody just thought you were old. That's okay, that was it. And you were on the Mothers Board. So these older Black women, I want you to know, wielded substantial power. Let me put it that way. You see, the pastor's name might be on the building. The pastor's portrait might be in the lobby. But I want you to know these women were the real power brokers. They were the real authority. They say, go, you went. They say, stop, you stopped. And that's just what it was. And so we understand the biblical model, right? The biblical model was older women teach the young women. And so that's what I thought the Mothers Board would be until I opened my eyes and I could see the authority that they wielded. And I thought, something happening here. So you had this Mothers Board, of which my own grandmother was a church mother. These women came from the rural South, now finding themselves in these northern churches, in my case, a storefront church in Brooklyn, New York, and serving on the Mothers Board. These women that I'm referring to served 6 days out of the week, primarily as domestic workers. For most of their life, they took care of other people's houses and other people's children, that until the middle of the 20th century, 85% of African American women were domestic workers. And so day after day, they were taking care of someone else's home, someone else's children. But Sunday came, and I watched my grandmother and the other church mothers put on their white, put on their hats, put on their gloves, put on their shoes. And I watched them being treated with such dignity and respect, being called mother, being called sister. And I watched them work. So eventually, I had a question that I wanted to bring to the Mothers Board, because I knew I was seeing something that was more than just the faithfulness of these women. And they were certainly faithful. They were certainly devout, but something else was happening. And so my question was this: what if this group of older Black women, these church mothers, my grandmother, what if I was seeing in action the greatest theologians that this nation has produced? I need you to take the question seriously, because by asking the question, I am upending everything that we traditionally understand about theology. And I'm a professional theologian. They pay me to do theology, okay? Can these women be theologians? Well, what would it mean if these women who lacked formal education could be theologians? It would mean that we would have to do theology differently. We would have to take the source material of their lives seriously. We would have to take what we had been labeling as mother wit and folk wisdom as serious theological reflection. It would mean that somehow God was revealing God's self through the lives of these older Black women with a message for the church at large, for the entire body of Christ. So, in my grandmother's kitchen, where I spent all of my time growing up, being raised by my grandparents, I realized that I was watching theology in action. The lights went off one day. I'm scared of the dark, Grandma. Don't worry. God does God's best work in the dark. What she did for me was upend the notions that I had imbibed of a white supremacist notion that there was light and there was darkness. God has a luminous darkness, and that was beautiful. In my grandmother's kitchen, with a pound cake in one hand and a Bible in another hand, my grandmother would say, "You can't heal people if you don't feed people." In my grandmother's kitchen, we would talk about the parables and what they mean. And she says, if you're not willing to touch someone, you can't love someone. So I watched her wash feet. I watched her anoint people with oil. There was something that was happening here. There was a theology that was developing. It was deliberate. It was constructive. It was systematic. It was more than folk wisdom. What if this was the greatest theologian I had ever known? What if the source material of how we understand who God is and how God operates in the world was here in a kitchen in Brooklyn? And what if my grandmother, like the generations of wisdom, women before her, like all women, were in fact the Theotokos, the God bearers? That's a term we use for Mary as we talk about how Mary carried God in flesh in her womb, the God bearer. But the term means so much more because it is Mary and the other women who are at the tomb and who bear the news of the gospel. What if what I was seeing were women bearing the gospel in flesh, generation after generation? What if that great cloud of witnesses included my grandmother, your grandmama, your auntie? It would change the way in which we would then take seriously this wisdom tradition that we've inherited. The food of choice in my grandmother's kitchen was soul food. And so that's what I learned to cook. That is my native food. I love it to this day. And I remember learning how to cook certain dishes and how to chop certain vegetables. And I was thinking about the origins of soul food because the origins of soul food are connected to the history of enslavement in this country. Soul food, which is now served at your finest restaurants, I'm sure even here, soul food emerged out of the scraps, the bits, the pieces that were left over and were given to enslaved people. The lesser cuts of meat, the things you would kind of throw away. And out of those bits and pieces and scraps, they created food to feed people who worked from sunup to sundown. They would take that tiny little piece of meat and they would put it in a batch of greens and they would make some cornbread. And somehow they were creating a feast with scraps. And so I watched that happen in my grandmother's house. I remember being the teenager and I would open the refrigerator and there would be nothing in there. And I'd close the door and I'd go sit. But hours later from that same refrigerator, she created a feast. And it all hit me. it all came together. This soul food, this grandmother's kitchen, this wisdom, this theology. My grandmother was a co-creator with God. God made from nothing everything. And I watched it week after week after week as from nothing, from scraps, from little bits of things, my grandmother made a feast. What does it mean for us today to stand here? Those of us who know that we are broken, we are in pieces, we are just little scraps of something. And God simply saying to us, you are more than enough. And out of your life and the nothing that it feels like, I will make something. Out of the inferior things, the lesser things, the things that no one wants, the marginalized, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, the people on the margins, those whose stories have been left behind, those with their backs against the wall. Out of their lives, I will make something, and I will call it good. Salvation and soul food, lessons from my grandmother's house. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing. Well, how about that for a start to TheoEd? Amazing. Dr. Pierce, thank you so much for sharing with us your wisdom, your love, and your story. You can see now why I was so lucky to be in her classroom. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Miroslav Volf. He is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Systematic Theology at Yale University. He is also the founding director of Yale Center for Faith and Culture. He is a member of the Episcopal Church here in the USA, but he's also a member of the Evangelical Church in Croatia. And he has spoken to audiences worldwide on both ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. Among his many books are Exclusion and Embrace, a theological exploration of identity, otherness, and reconciliation, and After Our Likeness, the Church as the Image of the Trinity. Dr. Volf's talk tonight is titled, Why Did God Create the World and Why We Need to Know? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Miroslav Volf to the TheoEd stage.
So why did God create the world? That's one of the most important big questions that we almost never ask. And maybe we have a good reason for that. The question is too big, maybe. Maybe it's even impossible to answer. How would we know what God had in mind when God was creating the world? And even if we could answer this question, maybe the question itself is not particularly important. Maybe it's a little bit like this heavy philosophical question, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? That's interesting for theological and philosophical geeks, but for the rest of us, not particularly exciting. Better maybe spend time attending to more urgent, more consequential issues, like helping improve lives of 2.6 billion people who live under $2 a day. Now, I'll return back to these 2.6 billion people, poor people, every single one of them child of God. And I'll try to show how knowing how to answer the question why God created the world is important for them too. But first, let me ask you a question, a personal question. Why do you exist? I'm not asking you to explain how it came for you to have been born. We all know biology involved in the issue. I'm asking for the purpose of your lives. Christians, along with other theists, believe that the purpose of our lives is not something we choose as we see fit, where I might choose an outfit when I go to a party. The purpose of our lives is woven into the very fabric of our being by the fact that God created us. And that takes me back to my original question. Why did God create the world, you and me included? Purpose of our lives is woven into the fabric also of the creation. We flourish and we languish, depending on whether we live in sync or against the grain of reality. So why God created the world is the question also about the right way to live in the world that God has created. It's about the purpose of your and my life and our vocation. So why did God create the world? Two books of the Bible, Genesis and Gospel of John, begin with the words, "in the beginning." And then they go and tell you that God created the world. But neither of them tells you immediately why God did that. Though, if you continue to read, pretty soon you come to realize that both of them emphasize one purpose for God creating the world. God created the world so that it may be home of God and humans together. Let me tell you how each of these books articulates that. The story of Genesis ends, and the arc of that story of Genesis ends with the end of the book of Exodus. God creates the world good. Human beings sally the creation's goodness. God calls Abraham. God delivers children of Israel from Egypt. And all of that with a single purpose, so that I may be their God and there may be my people, says the Lord. And finally, when the Lord appears in the tabernacle in glory, God has come to dwell with the people of Israel and lead them into the promised land. God's coming to dwell in Israel, people and the land, is the capstone of creation. Now, when you take Gospel of John, Jesus' words at the very end of his ministry, just before he was going to be arrested, condemned, and crucified, give us a clue as to why God created the world. In the beginning, Gospel of John said, God created all things. God revealed himself to Israel. God came and dwelled in Jesus Christ, became flesh. God bore human sin and conquered evil, all that for one purpose. So that the love with which the Father loved the Son before the foundation of the world may be in Jesus' disciples, indeed, so that the Father and the Son may come and dwell in them and with them. Purpose of God creating the world is to come to dwell in the world. Now, if you see these two stories being told by Genesis and Exodus, and you read the story of the Garden of Eden and of the New Jerusalem at the end of the Bible, you come to see that they too are about home. Why did God create first human pair and put them in the garden? So that they would make the garden flourish as their home. And why did God show up when the evening breezes came to walk in the garden, because the garden wasn't just their home. The garden was also the home of God. And finally, at the end, John of Patmos sees the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven onto the renewed earth. Now, so that he doesn't miss what's right there in front of his eyes, a loud voice from God's throne says, "Behold, the home of God among mortals. He will be with them, and they will be God's people." God and all the peoples of the earth having a home together. That's the end of the book of Revelation. So why God created the world is not a difficult question to answer at all. God has given that answer, and the answer is that the God, the Creator, is a homemaker God. Now let's return back to these 2.6 billion people, impoverished people, most of them homeless, many of them homeless, and most of them living in conditions that we would not even describe as home. I want to take this idea of poverty and analyze through that and another three dimensions of home-destroying forces in the world today. Let's start then first with economics of home. Imagine a home. Mother and a child earn $2, have $2 a day at their disposal. Next sibling has 40. Sibling after that has 400. And the father has $4,000 at his sole disposal. Now imagine the meal that they have together. Two of them at one end of the table, threadbare clothes, two half-full bowls of rice, and the pitcher of polluted water. On the other end of the table, a feast, culinary specialties, an exquisite fine, and people dressed in their finest. If that happened in your neighbor's home, what would you think? You'd be scandalized. Now, as the story that Jesus told about the rich man and Lazarus attests, God is scandalized about it as well. And yet you and I live in just such a home, our planetary home. Now, let's look at the politics of home. Politics often follows economics. This group on one end of the table would cast longing looks toward the other end of the table. And how would you blame them for doing that? And those who were feasting, if they dignified folks on the other end of the table with their attention, they would do so to underscore their own superiority and keep that other group at bay. For the proximity of the tribe of Lazarus could endanger their superior status and the benefits of their privilege. Pretty soon, a wall would go up, security apparatus would be established, and Lazarus would have his own little makeshift abode, and his soul might be full of resentment and quiet anger. Rich man, too, would build his castle, a manifestation of his wealth, but at the same time also of his fear. And yet both of them would be homeless, though each in a very different way. The rich man imprisoned behind the gilded gates of his luxury and fake superiority. And Lazarus, mired in languishing and precarity. Wealth and power are the two great enemies in God's homemaking project. Maybe I should put it this way. Not wealth and poverty as such, but our investments, our love of wealth, and our love and misuse of power are home-destroying forces. Without some wealth and some power, we couldn't have home. Indeed, without some wealth and some power, we couldn't even exist. And yet, when these acquire monstrous feature of what the Bible calls Mammon and Leviathan, they become home-destroying and subvert our languishing and our belonging. Now, Mammon and Leviathan are ancient enemies of home. It's also important for us to be on lookout of more modern versions or more modern home-destroying forces. I'll mention only two. And they also have kind of modern-sounding names: reification and escalation. But don't be fooled. Their force, their presence is everywhere around, and they too, like Leviathan and Mammon, are monsters. Let's look first at reification. Reification, you can call it in its modern term, or colloquial term you can use for it, thingification. All things, all God's creatures become things and mere things, liveless things. We have that tendency in most of the processes in modern society. Science is a very good example. It looks at things, living things also, from the perspective of there being things, of there being part of the network of mathematically calculable relations. Modern technology does the same thing. You know, people say for a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. For a person with a tool, everything looks like a manipulable object. Now, second modern home-destroying force I've called escalation. We live in modern societies the way we ride a bicycle. You have to move forward. When you stop moving, you fall. And it's not just that we have to move at a speed that suits us and however we are able to. Whether you want it or not, you are in a race, which means that you have to move faster and faster. And yet, you always end up being behind. That's the logic of escalation. Now, it has two dimensions. One of them concerns time, and the other concerns space. Time, well, we never have time. One of the sociologists has described the predicament in which we find ourselves today. He said, in modern societies, people, though they live amidst the material and technological affluence, they are suffering from temporal insolvency. In other words, we are always behind. We are always running behind. That means that we are always running. Think of the meals how our meals sometimes look. We rush through a meal, and while we are eating, we think about what we have left undone. We're checking what's happening around us and planning what's in the future. And those meals, like most of what we experience often, is like a speedy steps of a hamster in a wheel that is turning faster and faster. Hamster wheel can never be truly a home. And then there's a space escalation as well. When I was a student, we used to tell a joke about our president. His name was President Kuzmich. And the question was, what's the difference between President Kuzmich and God? God is everywhere, and President Kuzmich is everywhere except here. Students today cannot tell that joke, right? Without that joke also, the butt of that joke being turned against them. Because with a smartphone in their hand, they too are everywhere except here. Presence and time is what we need to live at home. And yet the logic of escalation tells us that we never have them. And what that means is who you are and what you do is not good enough. Where you are and what you have is not good enough. So we have our answers to our big question. Why did God create the world? So that the world would be home of God and humans together. We have these 4 forces that are undoing the sense of home. Our human and Christian calling is located right in the middle where these forces interact. Jesus Christ was a God come into the world in order to make it into God's planetary home. When he left, he gave the church his spirit so that we would continue to participate in the mission of God in the world. We can't make world into God's home. We can't often make it into our own home. And yet, we can do something. We can develop home-like relationships with each other. We can try to repair the breaches where the forces of unhoming have undone our sense of home. We can also invite the presence of God into our lives so that we ourselves can be homes of God and participate in the homemaking activity of God. Why did God create the world? So that you and I can be sites of God's home, an agent of God's homemaking. Thank you.
Well, friends, what an amazing 2 first talks. And Dr. Wolf, thank you so much. It's amazing. Our speakers don't share notes beforehand. There's no collaboration of their themes, but it strikes me that Dr. Pierce and Dr. Wolf both brought us home in some ways and invited us to think about tables and meals and how we fit into God's economy in this world that God loves so much. Friends, the great news is we still have half the program to go. But for now, we're going to take a very brief intermission, 10 minutes. We'll start again exactly at 5:05, so please feel free to stand up, stretch your legs. You can go out into the lobby where you'll find a book table with books on sale from Park Road Books from our various speakers. You'll have bathrooms out there and also information tables and, of course, TheoEd swag. Our t-shirts and our stainless steel tumblers are also out there as well. So we will see you back here in 10 minutes for the second half of our program.
any particular
I was
spot?
about 6 seconds
Oh,
too long.
well, okay, we can't put it up now.
Friends, welcome back to the second half of TheoEd Talks. You know, as we have done this series over the past few years, I've been thinking, how do you know it that you've made it as a speaker series? Like, what's a good metric for success? And I find that there are two things that suggest you've made it as a speaker series. Number one, your event is advertised on NPR. And I hope you heard our advertisements on the Charlotte-based WFAE over the past few weeks. We've been on various different programs. But there's a second reason you know you've made it as a speaker series, and this is the real reason. You begin to have your own swag. So if you are interested in such things, we have TheoEd swag on sale out in the lobby, both these t-shirts and some really beautiful stainless steel tumblers. You can purchase them afterwards, but for now, I want to give some of these away. We unfortunately left our t-shirt launcher in Atlanta, so you're going to have to rely on my arm. So you ready? Here's one. Here's a couple others. Go into this section. Oh, that's a bad throw. Over here. And then one more. All right. There's some free TheoEd t-shirts. The other great part about now having done TheoEd over 5 years is that we're beginning to accumulate some really compelling stories from our audience. For instance, you're sharing with us who your favorite TheoEd speakers have been and what their talks have meant for you. You're sharing with us how you are using TheoEd and the discussion guides as content for church-wide Sunday school classes. We also are learning that some TheoEd audience members are really, and I mean really, into TheoEd. Take Allie, for instance. When she arrived at a February 2019 TheoEd event in Atlanta, she was 9 months pregnant, which is remarkable in its own right. But get this, halfway through one of the talks, Allie went into labor. I kid you not. But the talk was so good that she waited until it was over before she left to go to the hospital. It's amazing TheoEd commitment, but seriously, if anyone goes into labor tonight, please feel free to slip out. Our speakers are incredible, but delivering babies is not in their contracts. Now, some TheoEd attendees don't want to miss a second of the action, and others are, well, a little bit less enthused. Take my son, Leo. It was a few years ago, and Leo was 5, and we were behind stage together right before a TheoEd Atlanta event was about to begin, and Leo did not want to stay for the program. At 5, he probably only would have been interested in a TheoEd talk if it had been given by Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter. Both of them were not available. It was no big deal, right, for Leo not to stay for the program, and we try for a younger audience in TheoEd, but I wouldn't say the 5 to 8 demographic is key to our success. Still, I wanted to have a moment to connect with my son, so I went up to Leo, I gave him a hug, and I said, "Hey, buddy, why don't you want to stay for TheoEd?" And he looked at me in the eyes with as serious an expression I've ever seen on him, and he said, "Dad, TheoEd is awkward, exclusive, and boring." And I didn't even know that he knew those words. And I thought at that moment, I was like, wow, that is the worst marketing ever. TheoEd, it's awkward, exclusive, boring. Buy your tickets now. We didn't use it as our tagline, fortunately. But speaking of tickets, I'm happy to announce that as of this weekend, tickets have gone on sale for our next TheoEd event, which is coming up on Sunday, September 18th at the Center Stage in Midtown Atlanta. And among the 5 speakers that were going to be joining us are 2 ones you might know of. One is Jim Wallace, a well-known journalist, writer, and social activist. And another is Kirsten Powers, who is a New York Times bestselling author, CNN journalist, who has recently released a book called Saving Grace that's all about how we can navigate the toxic divides in our culture without compromising on our convictions or our emotional well-being. Tickets are on sale both for the in-person event in Atlanta, but we're also selling tickets for the live stream. So even if you're a member of Charlotte and can't make the trip down to Atlanta, please go ahead and reserve your tickets. You can find those tickets at TheoEd.com. Again, that's Sunday, September 18th. Now let's get back to our program. Our third speaker tonight is Liz Clayson Kelly. She is the CEO of Roof Above, a Charlotte-based organization that's doing incredible work when it comes to addressing the problem of homelessness. Prior to arriving at Roof Above, Clayson Kelly was the executive director of the men's shelter in Charlotte. And during her time with them, she helped renovate their campus shelters with an eye towards human dignity. Clayson Kelly is a proud graduate of Davidson College, and she also has her Master of Public Policy from Duke University. Her talk tonight is titled On the Other Side of Judgment, Exploring the Housing First Approach. Please join me in welcoming Liz Clayson Kelly to the TheoEd stage.
Early in life, my mother taught me an important lesson about perspective. My mother was raised in poverty. She grew up in a coal mining camp in Harlan, Kentucky. It was exactly as you would imagine. There was a company store where you could only buy things on credit, a one-room schoolhouse for all the kids of the community. No indoor plumbing, only outhouses. I can remember I got in trouble in middle school. I got caught sneaking out to go roll a friend's house. You might remember this, where you put toilet paper in the trees of a friend. And in my fully defiant 13-year-old self, I said to my mother, "Come on, Mom, didn't you ever do anything like this when you were a kid?" And she patiently reminded me that growing up, her toilet paper was the Sears Roebuck catalog. Now, my father, he grew up very differently. He came from money, he came from the city, and with his family came high expectations. I can remember visits as a kid. My parents were always talking about my good grades or my sister's extracurricular activities. We were asked what careers we wanted to pursue. Now, my father adored my mother, but I always had the sense from his family that they did not think my mom was good enough. You see, what it seemed to me as a child when they looked at my mom's family, they saw poverty, lack of education, broken relationships, and divorce. But the thing is, when you look with eyes of judgment, you miss out. Yeah, my mom's family had a scarcity of things, but they had an abundance of love. When we would go visit as children, you never left the house. The main stage was the kitchen table or the living room. It was the people gathered, stories, so many stories, the laughter. I got introduced to Spam sandwiches. I thought they were amazing. And inevitably, at some point in a visit, I would crawl onto the couch or a comfy chair, and I'd fall into this deep sleep. You see, in Harlan, you had nothing to prove. You were simply loved for being. These visits, the sense of acceptance, was magical to me as a child. But if I had looked with eyes of judgment, I would have missed out on that gift. And that's the perspective I brought with me when I was 19 years old and I had an internship at what is now called Roof Above, a Charlotte-based nonprofit serving people in a housing crisis. I got placed at our day services center. We primarily serve people who are sleeping outside, our neighbors experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And if you looked with eyes of judgment, what you might see at our day services center is addiction, mental illness, criminal behavior, poor decisions, family abandonment. But much like Harlan, if you looked with eyes of judgment, you would miss out on the gift. With another perspective, you could see strength and courage, phenomenal resiliency, people who chose kindness time and time again, despite all the reasons not to. I found such a sense of life at that day services center that I went to work there after college and have dedicated my life to this work. Now, at our day services center, we were primarily focused on the most basic needs. We have showers and laundry facilities, a daily hot meal, a mailing address. We thought of our goal as to keep people alive and connect them to their next step out of homelessness. Really, an emergency shelter, mental health treatment, substance use treatment. Back then, the thinking was, okay, some underlying issue caused someone's homelessness. Before we move them back into housing, let's make sure we address or fix that underlying issue. So housing programs back then, if you were struggling with alcoholism, like you'd have to show that you were a certain number of months sober before moving in. If you were struggling with mental illness, the housing programs would want to see you're compliant with your medication. It was a system set up to show or prove that you were ready for housing. Some might say worthy for housing. It was a system that worked for some people. We had folks come through our doors that eventually got into housing, but there was a group of people whose challenges were so significant that they couldn't even fathom a way through all the hoops to housing. So they continued to come through our doors day after day, persisting in homelessness and the trauma that accompanies it. And because they were with us day after day, these are the people I got to know best and the stories that I got to hold dear. I listened to stories of loss, of violence, of rape. They were the stories behind the addiction and behind the health issues. And I can remember in my naive 20-year-old self, early 20s, having such huge emotions in my heart, such a sense of caring, and I would pray all the time that somehow these big emotions would translate and help heal and connect the person sitting across from me to their next step in the journey. Now, that thinking would be turned totally upside down in my mid-20s when I would walk into a workshop led by Bill Hobson, who would remind me that love is not a feeling in your heart. Love is an action. Bill was an early practitioner of a concept called housing first. At the time, it was a fairly new and incredibly controversial approach to ending homelessness. Housing first is exactly what it sounds like. You move someone from homelessness to housing first, without preconditions, and then surround them with supports. Here's how it would look. Say someone is on the street struggling with alcoholism or struggling with schizophrenia. You actually move them from homelessness into an apartment, and then a case manager, maybe a nurse, a psychiatrist, goes into the apartment and offers supports. Tenants sign a lease like anyone else. They're expected to pay 30% of their income towards rent. If they don't have any income, that means 30% is zero. There's no curfews, you can have visitors, but you are expected to follow the rules of the lease, which typically boil down to pay your rent and be a good neighbor. Housing First was based on two core beliefs. The first belief is that everyone needs and deserves a safe home. Housing isn't some sort of reward for being compliant to your treatment plan. It's a basic human need. Now, that probably doesn't sound controversial at all, but at the time, it was a complete reversal of a system. The system had been built that actually made us believe it was helpful to hold housing out to the end. Housing was what everyone wanted, so if you made it the final step, you would inspire people to connect with the services they felt people needed. Which brings me to the second core belief of Housing First, that the stability of home is actually critical to helping people achieve their goals. Housing isn't some sort of prize at the end of the journey. Housing is the starting point. It's the foundation to do the hard and courageous work of healing. Now, the first moment I heard about Housing First, I knew in my gut and my bones, this is the work I want to do. This is the work that places the value of someone's humanity at the center. But my second thought almost immediately was, am I even allowed to believe this? I had been so blinded, so shaped by the conventional thinking that I had not even seen the obvious answer that was sitting right in front of me. Housing was what people needed. But thankfully, Bill and others like him were pioneers in creating Housing First programs. And then they were really smart that they said, we're going to study this. Housing First might have been controversial, but through all the studies, it was shown incredibly effective. When you compare the Housing First approach to the traditional approach where people earn their way to housing, you found that Housing First was actually more effective. One of the key early studies found that after 5 years, 88% of people in Housing First programs remained stably housed, compared to less than half at traditional programs. And what I find really interesting is when you look at substance use and mental health symptomology, you actually had very similar outcomes, which meant in Housing First programs, even when you didn't require treatment, people were choosing to do that work. But the research that really got people's attention was that Housing First didn't just benefit the person moving from homelessness to housing, it benefited us all. Let me tell you the story of Charles to explain what I mean. Charles was born in a mill town in South Carolina. His father was a drinker, and as he put it, was friendly with the whip. He would become incredibly abusive to Charles when he drank. Charles was determined he would be different. He left home early, he married young, he started a family, and he found this little piece of solace from the trauma of his childhood. And as I've seen happen sometimes, when you get that little bit of stability, those memories you've been trying to keep away, to tamp down, come back to you. And Charles did the thing he saw his father do to numb his pain. He reached for alcohol. By the time I met Charles decades later, he'd spent more than 20 years in homelessness and was in the throes of alcoholism. Charles's whole life was organized around his drinking. He woke up and he was thinking, how am I going to get the money? How am I going to drink today? He would often drink to the point of passing out. Someone would see him, call 911, he'd be transported to the ER. He spent months as the top user of ambulance services in our entire county. In the ER, he'd spend a few hours, sleep it off. He'd be out the door as the sun rose. So I started getting up really early to go to the ER to talk to Charles about Housing First. He was unaccustomed to receiving visitors at the hospital, but was a very gracious host. I remember early on this one morning, I'm not an early riser. I'm like barely awake. We're leaving the hospital to walk to my car. I'm kind of stumbling, groggy. Charles is walking with such enthusiasm. It's almost like he's skipping. It's like, Charles, what's up with all this energy? He said, I get an extra pep in my step when I feel like people care. And it was hard not to care about Charles. He was a light, this huge personality who loved laughter. He likes to say, some people make sandwiches, I like to make a funny. He was the type of person who always asked about you before, sharing about himself. He would break unexpectedly into song and somehow other people would just join in. I asked him once, Charles, how did your heart get so big? He paused and responded somberly, I guess it's all the suffering. Charles was skeptical when I told him we wanted to move him into an apartment, and he was not alone. I remember telling an emergency room doctor about our plans. He sneered, the only way Charles will ever stay in housing is if you put wild Irish rose in every single cabinet. Having watched Charles cycle in and out of the ER, his sight had been blinded by judgment. But what I find so compelling about Charles's story, it was not the housing itself that transformed his life. It was simply the hope of housing. You see, as Charles's move-in date to his apartment got nearer, he began to finally believe that his life was somehow actually going to be different. And it made him think differently about his current context. Charles did the thing that the hospitals and courts had been asking him to do for years. He checked himself into treatment for alcoholism. And that was how his more than 20 years of homelessness ended. It wasn't because we told him, you have to do this. It wasn't because we said, hey, you get this prize if you do this. It was because we said to him, you, Charles, are worthy of housing. Come as you are. I imagine he felt something like I felt on that couch in Harlan years ago. You have nothing to prove. You are loved simply for being. And of course, housing dramatically transformed Charles's life. He had a key in his own place, but it transformed the life of this community as well. You see, Charles was no longer passing out drunk, which meant there were no ambulance rides and no ER visits, no arrests for things like open container, and all of that has a community cost. Study after study of Housing First shows the community benefit of housing people. At Roof Above, when we opened our first Housing First apartment community, 50 tenants agreed to allow us to study the impact of housing on their lives. We compared the 2 years before they moved into housing to the 2 years after. And what we found is those 50 tenants went to the ER 648 fewer times, an 81% reduction. There were 292 fewer days in the hospital, meaning their hospital bill was reduced by $2.4 million. When we looked at the criminal justice records, we saw similar things, 80% reduction in arrest, and most of the arrests prior to housing were minor infractions like trespassing and public urination, open container. We all benefited when people were housed. I like to think of that as God's economics. When we value and honor the humanity of someone else, it's not just them who benefits, but us. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. What Housing First has taught me is the same lesson that I learned in Harlan all those years ago. On the other side of judgment, there are great gifts. Housing First is now widely accepted as a best practice of ending homelessness, but I don't think we're done learning all that it has to teach us. Where are we being called today to look beyond judgment, and where do we all have the opportunity to be transformed? Where are we like that ER doctor where disappointment has led to cynicism and we can no longer see the hope of transformation? Where are we like the naive Liz in her 20s, feeling these huge feelings of care and compassion and somehow missing the obvious answer that's right in front of us? Where are there still systems that need to be transformed, reversed, where we put the value of humanity at the center? I think about our criminal justice system. We know that when people leave jail or prison, if they have a stable home and employment to return to, they are much less likely to go back. And yet we allow for a system that puts barriers between them and housing and employment. I think about the disease of addiction and how it is ravaging our communities. In 2020, nearly 100,000 people died of drug overdoses. All that lost human potential and that immeasurable grief that accompanies it. We know that our approach to the disease of addiction is not working. But will we have the courage to go to the other side beyond judgment and put the value of someone's humanity at the center? My friends, we are an imperfect people. We might wish that were not true. We might draw all sorts of lines that help us feel more pure, but we are a broken people. if we stop running away from that fact, if we start really seeing and embracing the complexity, the strength and resilience of another, there is a life beyond judgment that benefits us all. Thank you.
These talks aren't getting any worse as we go through. Liz, thank you so much for sharing your passion, your heart, your story, and your life with us. I don't know about you, but I sort of want to bring back out all three of our speakers and have them do their talks again, because I feel like it needs to sink in a little bit. So, Dr. Pierce, come on. No, just kidding, just kidding. Just as a reminder, as you have comments and questions about the individual talks or just things you want to share with our speakers, please do go ahead and text them to the number that's found in your program. And for those of you who are streaming online, that number is in the comment section of the live stream. We really would love to hear from you. But for now, we have to turn to our fourth and final speaker. And that speaker is Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, the senior pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois. Pastor Moss is a widely sought after activist, speaker, preacher, and author who roots himself in a passion for equity and justice. He also has founded the Unashamed Media Group, a faith-based organization that is helping to produce and curate stories that transform the mind and inspire the heart. Pastor Moss's talk tonight is titled, By Any Greens Possible. Please join me in welcoming to the TheoEd stage, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III.
Arguably, one of the greatest cultural icons of the 20th century is a gentleman by the name of El Hajj Malik Shabazz, more popularly known as Malcolm X, previously known as Malcolm Little. His family revered a wonderful Black Jamaican liberationist Christian by the name of Marcus Garvey. He eventually fell under the teachings of a person by the name of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He was a prophet. He was our prophet of Black self-esteem. Unfortunately and tragically, he was assassinated in 1965 in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York. But people today are still inspired by his words and his methodology. Now, some may raise the question, why do I lift up a Muslim icon at this moment? I say to you that truth is not held solely in Christian vessels. The truth can be held because God is sovereign. The truth is not only held within a Christian vessel, a humanist framework, or even a Jewish Torah or Buddhist practice. God is sovereign, and God can use whomever God determines to use by any means God determines necessary. God can use Malcolm X, Nipsey Hussle, or Kendrick Lamar. You can be hustling all your days to sacrifice, or you can find out that you're messed up, I'm messed up, but if God got us, we gonna be all right. It is Malcolm who stated that we declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be respected as a human being, to be treated as a human being, which we intend to bring about by any means necessary. Malcolm gives an invitation to us all to let us know that the community will determine the methodology by which it will utilize for transformation. He is talking about self-agency, self-determination, that we must look within the community that has been marginalized to be the creative force that will design and create new ways of transformation. I found an ally of Malcolm, an ally within the Old Testament, They didn't know each other, but I believe they functioned with the same particular artistry and imagination. A person by the name of Nehemiah. Nehemiah believed in doing things by any means God deems necessary. The walls were broken in Jerusalem. And Nehemiah first did an evaluation, praying and evaluating, what should we do about these walls? And then brought the community in and said, you will be the contractors and the subcontractors to benefit from the rebuilding. We're not going to bring in someone from the outside to build the walls. And then they did something magnificent that really fascinated me. They decided that they would rebuild the walls, but they would rebuild the walls with techniques that they had learned from their ancestors. The bricks would not be imported from somewhere else. They would design them. They would create the wall, fix the wall, using green, sustainable techniques. Malcolm X and Nehemiah, both recognizing that we must do things by any means we determine necessary, but I give a remix and say that Nehemiah was really saying that we must do this by any means necessary. But our greatest challenge in this world today is not that we lack the resources, not that we lack the funding, but we lack the imagination to imagine a new world. It is Albert Einstein who stated that imagination is greater than genius. Give me imagination because the genius will always work in a box, but one who has imagination will continue to break out of the boxes that other people have created. Malcolm and Nehemiah give us an invitation around imagination. And imagination is what we lack at this moment. And imagination is what we need if we're talking about community development. If we are to develop the community, those communities that have been marginalized, we must use imagination, or what I like to call moral artistry. And the African American community historically has utilized moral artistry, moral imagination, to look in the face of despair and say, I refuse to take hold. It is within the African American community that we brought forth into this country a unique and new perspective in reference to faith. Many will say that they are Christian, but in the African American community, it is known as Black religiosity or Black spirituality, and it is older than Protestantism, and it reminds Western Christianity that it did not come from the West, but it has African roots. It is Howard Thurman who would probably call it democratic mysticism, the recognition that every human being has the mark of the sacred upon them. By any means necessary, how do we build a new community in the face of great challenges? Maybe within our own network in Chicago, we have a perspective that can assist us in terms of using moral artistry, moral imagination, and saying by any means necessary. I serve at a church on the south side of Chicago. Come by if you can. And there in that church, we made a decision that we were going to be a part of the rebuilding of our community, using a framework known as by any means necessary. Let me share a story with you. Right down the street from our church, there is a library known as the Carter G. Woodson Library. It has the largest collection of African American literature in the Midwest. But this local library was falling apart. It had a scaffolding outside because I guess the city of Chicago, when they got their contractor, didn't do the correct job. They were afraid the bricks were going to fall on people's heads, so they put a scaffolding out there. The scaffolding had been out there for 20 years. It had been out there so long that people assumed that the scaffolding was a part of the architecture. And so our Community Development Corporation, along with several other organizations, got together and said that we want this library rebuilt, renovated. So we met with the Library Commission, and they came to us and said, we appreciate you all so very much. We love the collection of this library, but we don't have the money to rebuild this library. Our Community Development Corporation, just like Nehemiah, had already done the inspection and had done the research and pulled out a piece of paper and said, well, according to your records, you built 5 libraries, but none of them were in Black communities. We want you to know that we are well aware that your spending priorities are not on the South Side. We exited the meeting. I turned and said, oh, by the way, when is your next Library Commission meeting? Said next week. I said, thank you very much. That Sunday, I stood up in the pulpit. I said, I have an announcement to make. For those of you who are available at Wednesday at 7 p.m., we want you to go by to the Library Commission meeting. I did not go to the Library Commission meeting, but I kid you not, the Library Commission meeting was adjourned at 7:59. I got a call at 8:01 saying, could you please meet with us? We think we have a solution to the library. You must understand, nobody goes to a Library Commission meeting unless you are a Dewey Decimal nerd. That's the only reason you go. But yet, several hundred people showed up with one single question, that the library, Carter G. Woodson, that has the largest collection of African-American literature is falling apart. They met with us, and then they said to us, we want you to know we found the money. We have a grant for $10 million to rebuild the library. We stopped them right there. And we said, that's not enough. Because the people in this zip code have to rebuild the library. The people in this zip code have to benefit from the rebuilding. So what you must do is find a contractor who looks like us. You must utilize green techniques, but also use people from the mass incarceration system so they can be trained. They looked at us and said, we've never seen anything like that before. We said, well, we want to share with you that we did the same thing at our church. When we renovated our church, we used these same principles in order to rebuild our church. We used green. We used people from the mass incarceration system, and we had people from our community. Long story short, the library was built with that 3-pronged strategy. But we did not stop there because we were committed to our community. We also purchased homes that were delinquent, tax delinquents, and we used that same framework to rebuild those homes. The homes that we purchased for about $30,000. After we were finished with the renovation, they were worth $150,000 to $199,000, but they were only sold for $110,000 because we wanted people to walk in with equity. We didn't stop there. We purchased 27 acres of land down the street, partnered with one of the largest healthcare providers in Illinois, Advocate Health, and a medical center was built. Not a clinic, a medical center. Next to that medical center will be a healing garden. So instead of just prescribing pills because someone's in pain, maybe they can walk through nature to reduce their stress. And now we're working on housing and a hotel, and also it will be the largest urban farm in the city of Chicago, using the same principles by any means necessary. Moral artistry, a moral imagination. Thus far, we have facilitated the investment of $35 million already on the south side of Chicago. By the time we are finished, we believe that $125 million will be reinvested in a community people said could not come back. When you have the imagination and turn that imagination over to God, anything is possible. But it is through this idea of moral artistry, partnering with other people and communities, that transformation can take place. I like to borrow from the African American tradition, the tradition of jazz, which is really not only a musical tradition, but is also a spiritual tradition. For jazz taught America democracy before America even knew what democracy was all about. It was those people from Haiti who made their way to New Orleans in a place called the Congo Square. And in the Congo Square on Sundays, it was Africans who were able to spend time freely singing and dancing and reflecting upon their own experience. And in those spaces, they were able to hear the sounds of indigenous people, Spanish and German and French. And that is where jazz was created, out of that space. But jazz gives us an ethic that I believe is transformative for our nation. Because jazz takes music, musicians, and instruments that are not supposed to play together, but they do. The saxophone is supposed to play for the marching band. And it is the piano that is to play for that classical European style of music. The drum is not to play polyrhythms that come out of the African tradition, but simply a 1-2 marching sound. And if you play the bass, you are to play it with a bow, not with your fingers. But in the jazz band, all of these elements come together and they begin to play. And what is so beautiful about the jazz band is that the jazz band says that everybody has the right to solo. Everybody has a right to express themselves uniquely from their own particular tradition. So you will never hear the saxophone trying to tell the piano, you have to sound like me. You will never hear the piano trying to tell the bass, you have to sound just like me. And you will never hear the drum telling everybody, you just got to sound like me. No, everybody is given the right to solo. Because it uses moral artistry and imagination. It recognizes that imagination is greater than genius. And if we as a country choose to imagine, we might be able to do what a person by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois said. We might be able to become these yet to be United States of America. If we use an ethic of self-determination, self-agency, moral artistry, if we are willing to empower people in communities that have been marginalized, if we are willing to use green techniques and sisters and brothers from the mass incarceration system, we might be able to see our community transformed. A church on the south side of Chicago. We're not a wealthy church. We're just working class folks who live up south. On the south side of Chicago, the city of big shoulders. And we are functioning. We are changing our community day by day by any greens necessary. Thank you.
Wow, friends, what an incredible series of talks we've had tonight. I am blown away by the depth, the wisdom that we've heard from our speakers, and I'm so incredibly grateful for all of you and what you've had to share. But we're not done quite yet. Now we want to hear from you. In just a second, I'm going to bring all 4 of our speakers back up onto the TheoEd stage, and I'm going to have a chance to present to them some of the questions and comments that you have been sending in to us by text all throughout tonight's program. This will be a short Q&A, about 15 minutes or so. Give us 1 minute. We're going to pull out some chairs and bring all of our speakers back up. So give us 1 minute of transition, and then we'll move into our Q&A time. Now, please join me in welcoming all 4 of our speakers back onto the TheoEd stage. Thank you. Almost there. Thank you. All right, friends, please come. right, I'm going to sort of lurk in the shadows here so that the spotlight is on our speakers. But again, thank you all so much. I have to say that we have done now 7 of these events, and at every one we have found interconnections between our speakers, even though that's not something that we planned as part of our programming. But I've never seen the interconnections as rich and as deep as has happened tonight. So I am grateful that the Spirit is moving in this place and has moved through the work that you have done in the last few weeks or maybe even months to prepare. So amen and thank you for that. In that spirit, this first question is really sort of for all of you, so any of you might jump in. So the question is, how can we dismantle fake superiority and fear of the affluent in ways that welcome those who are marginalized? So there's a couple parts there, and I think this hits upon different elements of what each of you has spoken about. So, and I'll tell you what I tell my students all the time in the classroom: if you make eye contact with me, that counts as volunteering. So if you don't want me to call you first, just look to the side.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
I think I got fear of affluence, I think.
How can we dismantle the fake superiority and fear of the affluent to welcome the marginalized? I'm hearing kind of imagery, Dr. Wolf, in your talk about the table, that powerful image that you gave us, and the disdain and resentment that was coming from both ends as you looked upon the other.
That's a wonderful summary of some of the things that I've tried to say. But I think we've got answers in different speakers here, and I'll pass it on to you, Liz, and then you can turn it around, because I heard in what you said kind of this absence of judgment, which is to say then recognizing just in everyone without any qualification the goodness that is there that needs to be simply appreciated and embraced.
Yeah, I was having a debate with my husband as I was preparing for this. I mean, I think part of my deep belief is it's our own fear of our own brokenness that causes us to see others differently. And so it's accepting ourselves that allows us to accept the other. And I mean, the work that we do is relational, and I just think relationships are such a powerful force of transformation if we allow them to be. But it's that courage to allow ourselves to be transformed.
This second question follows, but goes in maybe a little more personal way. This person asks, all 4 of you stress the need to see people in the world differently. You've all used different language for that, but you all are inviting us to see through a different pair of lenses. And they're asking, who is one person in your life that has helped you see the world differently? And I would actually love, if possible, to hear from all of you on this. So Dr. Pierce, do you want to start us off?
I love the question because the question is functionally about the Imago Dei, about the image of the divine that is in each of us. When I was a child, I gave an Easter speech, and it was a good Easter speech. I was good at Easter speeches. And so my prize for the Easter speech was a coloring book. I was a little kid, so I got a coloring book, and I got one of those Precious Moments Bibles. I don't know if you all remember this. It's a little tiny Bible, and it was leather, and inside were colored pictures, and Jesus was holding the little lamb, and Jesus doing different things, whatever. So I got this as a prize for my Easter speech, and between giving the speech, getting the prize, and us getting home, somehow it disappeared, and my grandparents took it away, and I never saw it again. Years later, I would find out that they were very invested in me seeing images of the divine that looked like me. That I would see pictures of a brown Jesus. I would see images of a Jesus who had hair like mine, who looked like the people in my community. And so I share that story to answer the question because I will say that my grandparents were trying to teach me not only was I made in God's image, but that I should love myself as I was. That so powerfully changed everything for me in my life. And so to see the divine spark, thinking about Howard Thurman there, or as the Quakers say, the divine spark, the light of God in everyone. It was that little girl whose grandparents were invested in her seeing images of the divine that looked like her. And I want people to find the God in them, in each of us, right, who resembles us and whose image we are made. Transformative.
Thank you. Reverend Dr. Moss, how would you answer that question? Who has helped you see the world differently?
I would say it was my sister, who's no longer with us. She suffered from mental health challenges, paranoid schizophrenia, actually, was an absolutely stunningly brilliant human being. As a child, when I would go to bed, she would read stories to me, but she wouldn't read children's stories. She would read Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston. Those are the people that she would read to me. I didn't know what I was hearing until I got to college. And I realized I've heard this before.
Wow.
They were my bedtime stories. So witnessing a woman who struggled, but yet was brilliant and deeply loved her brother, because we would go out every Friday night to Baskin Robbins and to a movie. She said, "You're gonna be my date, come on." And that love put me on the path for a deep love of literature and poetry and understanding the wide range of theologies that come out of our tradition. And so she helped me see the world differently. And so my eyes see those who struggle with mental health challenges radically differently because of her assistance.
Thank you for sharing that. Liz, how would you answer that question?
So one person who comes to mind is Caroline, who I met when I was 19, that first summer in my internship. And I interacted in her life as she was passing away, and I got to spend time in the hospital. And she had lived a life of sexual violence from very early on, was engaged in sex work, and died of HIV/AIDS. And I will say, I have a firm belief in heaven because of her, because I got to see all this beauty that never really got to, unfurl its wings in the world. And I have such a belief that her spirit is fully in its potential somewhere. And I think she also just taught me how far I have to go, right? Just her strength was amazing. And so she inspires me to this day.
Thank you. And Dr. Wolf, tell us about someone who has helped you see the world differently.
It's somewhat, it's almost, I was thinking about this question about see, and it's almost, first of all, feel the world differently than actually seeing. And it's my nanny. We had 3 rooms in the back of a courtyard. She had none because her husband had died, was killed in the war, or didn't come back. Completely impoverished. My parents had to work, and somebody had to take care of us children, and so it was 2 things that came together. And she became the angel of my childhood, and this woman who was that tall had this fragility, but actually inner strength of joy that I had no idea from where it was coming. But what I know is just that I grew up with the gentle song of this very small woman who was burdened by incredible suffering and yet somehow rose beyond it. I don't think anybody has had impact on me as much as her joy.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. It gives us an insight into your life, into the lives that have influenced you, and that's powerful. Dr. Pierce, this question is about your talk, and you spoke in such beautiful and powerful ways about your grandmother and these women that you knew in the Black church who were theologians as much as Karl Barth or John Calvin or anyone else. And that is powerful and strikes me as true. This question asks, how do you bring their voices into seminary training, into the classroom, into places where people can be exposed to the wisdom and the theology of these beautiful women that you've named?
That's a wonderful question, and you're uniquely qualified to ask it because, of course, we've been in the classroom together. I have a responsibility as someone who teaches theology to teach the wide range of it. And so it is the Barths, it is Calvin, it is Luther, and that's wonderful. But I also am very, very clear that part of my responsibility is helping people to understand their own histories and heritages and stories and how you got to be where you are. And so how I bring it into my classroom is sometimes I'll ask a question. They think it's sort of rhetorical, but it's not. I'll ask the question, how are you here today?
Mm-hmm.
Who's not here in the room, but who sent you here? For me, the question was, what praying grandmother did you have that made it possible for you to be in this classroom today? And by asking that question, I'm not only trying to get at a lineage. This isn't actually for me about genealogy, but this is about who all of these members of this great cloud of witnesses are, and the responsibility we have to tell their stories as part of our faith practice. We have to call the roll. We have to say the names so that these people live even long after they're gone. This is what so much of the scripture does. And so when Timothy is talking about the faith that lived in your grandmother Lois and also lives in you, it is to call the roll. And so that's one of the techniques I've consistently used in the classroom, because you didn't get here by yourself. No one got here by itself. None of us on this stage, we didn't get here by ourselves. And so to remind us of that, who brought you here, got you here.
I feel like I've seen you do that in the
classroom. I did it in the classroom with you. Absolutely, absolutely.
Pastor Moss, you speak of your church in such a powerful way, but you're not just doing religious stuff. One might say that you're doing political stuff. You are doing economic stuff. You are doing civic stuff. Tell us, like, what in your theology, what in your ecclesiology has helped you imagine the sort of church without borders that you live and lead in?
Being out of the Black church tradition. The Black church is not framed in the same way of separating sacred and secular. You can't do that. For example, I remember going to a Luther Vandross concert years ago, and we were taken by this group. It was Luther Vandross and whatever. They were, trying to help us see it. And I remember seeing a woman shouting in the third row. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, she goes to my church. But she was shouting in the same manner that she would at church. Because Luther was hitting those no. I mean, he was doing that thing, and
that's a word.
And that's right. That's a word. And she recognized the spirit within that. So that's the first thing. There is no sacred and secular separation. Polis or politics, that means the affairs of the city. And it's the role of the spiritual community to ensure that we are moral artists in the affairs of the city. And I don't believe that we should give away civic engagement to people who have no moral compass.
Amen. One of the things that reminds me about is that in the early 2nd century of church history, the church was known in the Roman Empire world, but not for the Jesus stuff or the resurrection stuff. They were known for their response to poverty. Mm-hmm. They were known to be turning the world upside down. They didn't have that sacred secular divide. We've reified that. We have accumulated that over the history, and it is amazing to see you inspiring us to get back to our roots, to get back to that place. Dr. Wolf, you again, I want to go back to this imagery of the table. That really is sticking with me, and I think it's sticking with our audience. And you talked about what it's like to have the family who makes $2 a day, and the family who has much more than that at the other end of the table. What has to happen for the affluent members, the folks on the one end of the table, to see the other members as family, right? It's one thing to say, well, they're friends or they're guests or something like that, but you're inviting us to say, no, they're family. How does that move happen? Because it seems to me that unless that move happens, it's just charity. It's just some maybe acts of kindness, but you're saying something much bigger than that.
Yeah, so I think of the whole world as a single home. And once you start thinking of the whole world as a single home, then you've got family. And you've got the God of the single home, then we are all family. The question really becomes not so much whether at some kind of intellectual level people are going to get that point. I think most humans, when you talk to them, get that point. How do we divest ourselves from our investments in only our well-being first? How do we function in such a way that the whole system is not predicated on the striving for superiority, so that I've got to be above somebody because otherwise I'm not who I am. So that's the really big question that for me it has to start locally. It has to start exemplifying, which is to say, it is a cultural transformation, which is a spiritual transformation, and it needs the split of politics from religion, of economics from religion. Sacred and secular have to be divided, had to be put together, because otherwise we don't have a sense of sacredness of the human being and honoring human being each. No matter what their qualities are, no matter what their state of repair is, they, qua human beings, have dignity. How do you get to that? I think you need to see them as God's creatures.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it makes me think that your metaphor might actually be just a literal invitation to actually share a table with someone who's a lot different than you. Maybe that act, again, our food, the homes that you all have spoken of, maybe that's not just a nice overarching frame, but there's a literal invitation to share a table with someone. Liz, I want to ask you one last question. And look, I could do this all night. I'm about ready to pull up a table and bring in some of my grandmother's ravioli and just have a little meal around here and have some fellowship together. But we need to let you all go. But Liz, let me give you this one last question. It seems to me, and this question is getting at this, that when we talk about addressing the problem of homelessness or poverty generally, especially church communities place a lot of emphasis on how we feel, good intentions. And you are actually pushing us beyond that to think about effectiveness, or what are the results, or what are the consequences. How can you, there's like 10 questions in here for me, and several of them are here on this page. How do we turn love from a feeling into an action? Like, what's that point of conviction that makes the difference?
Yeah, I have like a good bit of embarrassment of who I was in my 20s, right? When I think about like all my naivete and what I walked in, and it was, just by the grace of those we serve teaching me along the way. But I am also a nerd. I'm a data nerd, I'm a math nerd, and we really owe it to other human beings not to simply come with feelings that, we often really are often about how things make us feel, and instead to use all of the human intellect that we have to solve what feel like intractable problems, because there is no problem, I believe, that is actually intractable. I mean, we heard it here tonight. It's like, if we have the will, if we really understand the value of another human life, we have the ability to figure these things out. And so, but I do think it's critical on these social issues we use research and we use our intellect and not just our hearts.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And again, to all of you, thank you so much. Please give them a round of applause again. Well, friends, I'm sad to say this brings our night's program to a close. We are so glad that you have chosen to spend time here in this place and with one another as we've encountered these incredible speakers and the words of wisdom that they have passed along to us. As you exit tonight, just a few notes. There is Park Road Books, a local bookseller, is selling selections of books that these amazing folks have authored, so you can buy them right outside. Then you can buy them and walk a few feet down, and you'll see that all four of our speakers will be set up at their own tables. They can sign books you've just purchased. They're happy to be available to meet and greet you for a few moments as we all move out from this place, so please take advantage of that. Also in the lobby, of course, there's the TheoEd swag. We hope you might buy some of that. No, honestly, we're losing money on it. This is not a money grab sort of thing. There also is a table with more information about the Candler Foundry and various ways you might be involved. There's also information about Candler. If this stuff is really piquing your interest and you want to go to seminary, there's a table out there about admissions. There's also information about our partner for this event, First Pres Charlotte. What else do I need to tell you? These talks will soon be available online, high quality digital videos. The individual talks will be available online at theoed.com/watch. There you can find all of our past talks. It'll take a second to get them up, but in the meantime, what we'll do is we'll make the live stream of this event available for you to replay. So if you want to share it with someone, you just want to rewatch it, you'll be available to do that. So just look on our homepage, theoed.com, to find out that information. When you're there, subscribe to our podcast, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I think I'm using the right words about the social media stuff. And check out the other talks. There are some amazing ones out there. We hope that you use them to enrich your own faith journey, but also share them with others. Again, we are so grateful for you. We're so grateful for Queens and the Gambrell Center and First Pres Charlotte for helping to make all of this happen. Friends, be well, stay safe, and hopefully see you next time. Take care. Thank you. See you next time. Take care. Thank you. Next time. Take care.